what I'm going to do here is just create a basic arm rig for this half character here. Normally you'd want to do it on a full character, but I just have a half for demonstration purposes. So what I'm going to do is build the arm, but what I want to do is build it as straight as possible. If I try and build it in this direction, I'm probably going to get it messed up. So what I'm going to do is just create my joints. I'm going to put one right where my shoulder wants to be, and I'm shift select and clicking to give it an elbow, a wrist, and a wrist point. So this is going to look out at there. And I'm going to rotate it down to match into my arms. And what I want to make sure is that everything lines up. So actually I got super lucky on that elbow. And let's see how I did on my wrist. My wrist could be actually, well, it's pretty much right where I wanted to. If I did want to move it, I would make sure to move it only in X. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'd leave it like that. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is take a look at these arm joints. And I want to look at their local transformations, or local rotation axes, and make sure they're to my liking, which they are. I have X pointing down the joint, Z forward, Y up. This is fine for what I'm doing. And basically, as long as they all line up in the same direction towards each other, you should be good. What you don't want is to have these guys so that they're aiming in different directions. Okay, so I'm going to hide my geometry here, and let's start building this arm. So the first thing I'm going to do is name it. So shoulder, joint, elbow, joint, and wrist, joint. And what you'll notice is that my shoulder has rotations on it. I don't want that on there, so I'm going to freeze those out. So when you do modify freeze transformations, you want to make sure joint orient is turned off. And when I hit that, it goes to 0, but our orientation stays the same, which is good. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is make sure that when I put IK on here, that it bends in the right direction. Mine doesn't know yet because I built it perfectly straight. So what I want to do is set what's called a preferred angle. So I'm going to rotations, and I'm going to rotate in only Y-axis. I'll right click anywhere out here and say set preferred angle, and put it back. Now Maya knows that it wants to bend this way when I put IK handle on there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is put an IK handle on. So we'll go skeleton, IK handle tool. Make sure I use a rotate plane solver. Just click on the shoulder, click on the wrist, and it creates an IK handle for me. I'm going to hide that away. And basically, I know it's a rotate plane solver because when I twist, I actually twist my arm, and if I hit T, I have a special manipulator to show my pull vector, and I can use that to animate the arm as well. And I can move it, and everything looks like it's doing what it's supposed to do. That's inverse kinematics. You move from the end of the joint, the end effector there. Now the thing is, I don't want to have to always go in here and hit T to move this. And if you notice that I always have translations on my IK handle, I could freeze those, but things tend to get a little bit messy. So instead what I'm going to do is make just two controls to do everything for me. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an end control out here. Make sure everybody's at 0, great. That matches the exact local rotation axis of this joint. So I'm going to create a circle. And just to make it look like something else, I'm going to just give it, going to give it a look of some sort, which is fine. Really doesn't matter what it looks like. And delete its history. Freeze its transformations. And I want to do is snap it right to that exact same location. The easiest way to do that is to select the joint, select the control, and do a point constraint and an orient constraint. The orient constraint is going to change the rotations of this to match. So if I go ahead and show the local rotations of this control here, you see they match perfectly with that joint. So what I'm going to do is go in here, and all I needed those constraints for was to line this up. So I'm going to go in here and delete those constraints, so I don't need them anymore. I just wanted to set things up. Now you notice that I have rotations and translations on here. I could freeze that out, but if I do that, I'm going to lose that rotation axis match. So watch what happens. Okay, so see now that my rotations don't match, that's not what I want. I want them to match exactly. So I'm going to undo that. Instead, what I'm going to do is add a group above this that makes it match exactly. So there's a couple different ways we can do this. One way is actually just to create an empty group. So if you go to Edit Group, it creates a null object group. Basically, it's just a transform. It has translate, rotate, scale, and that's it. And what I'm going to do is do that exact same thing. I'm going to make it be in the exact same spot. So I'm going to select that joint, select the null, point constraint, orient constraint, then go to that null, delete the constraints. And right now what I have is actually a NURB circle and a null that have matching values. So what I'm going to do is just take that NURB circle and parent it underneath the null object by hitting P. And now what you notice is that my NURB circle, all my values got zeroed out. because compared to its parent, it's at the exact same position, and that's what we want. That's going to work perfect for us. So I'm going to change that NURB circle to IK control, give it a better name, and what I'm going to do is connect everything to it. So what I'm going to do is take this IK handle, I'm just going to parent it underneath, and you notice that when I move it, it moves the arm a little bit. When I rotate it, it moves the arm. When I move it, it moves the arm. And you notice that wrist is always kind of looking down this joint chain. In certain cases, I'm going to want to lock this whole hand to like a wall or a table or something like that. I'm going to want it to respond exactly to what this controller is doing. So I'm going to just create an orient constraint between this control and the joint. So select the control, select the joint, and say constrain, orient. And I want to make sure I have maintain axis off, and I want all axes. Great. So now, if you notice when I move this, it's going to stay in line with what that control is doing. But I'm still getting this movement on my shoulder, which actually isn't all that bad, but I want to control it a little bit better than that. And see, I can now zero this out, it goes back to its original position, which is great. So what I'm going to do is create what's called a pull vector constraint. Remember that if I hit T, I have these special controls back here. So what I'm going to do is just make another NURB circle. Using V, I'll snap it to the shoulder. I'm going to move it back in Z and just freeze its transformations and delete its history. And delete its history. There we go. And you can make it look pretty if you want. Grab some of the vertices and make it look abnormal somehow. Alright, great. So I'm going to rename it because the constraints name themselves based on what you're constraining with. So I'm going to say pull vector control or something like that. You can name it whatever makes sense. Select that, select the IK handle, and I'm going to go to a special constraint called a pull vector constraint. Under constraint, pull vector. And it has no options really other than wait. So I'm just going to hit apply and watch what happens with this green line right here. Oop, there we go. See how it lines it straight up into it. That means that now, wherever I move this, that shoulder and that elbow are going to point to. So if I move the arm over here, this controls the wrist, and if I move that control, it's going to tell that elbow where to point. Incidentally, I could snap this to the elbow and move it back directly in, if it makes a little more sense to you. As long as it's pointing at it. And the one thing we want to watch out for is what's called pull vector flipping. So what can happen, or IK flipping, is that if we cross over the line right through here, see how my arm suddenly flips on itself? That's called IK flipping. And if I put this back to 0, you can see even more. I'm going over here and bloop, it flips to the other side. We don't want that, but we can animate out of it, which most people do. So we can bring it back here, and I say, you know what, I'm going to bring this up back there, and now I'm not going to flip. So that's just what we do for the IK control. So now what I do is set up some FK controls on here as well. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to make it somewhat interesting. And I say somewhat because I don't want to spend all day making controls. I'm going to freeze its transformations. I'm going to put its pivot directly in the center here. Whoops, I'll hold an X. There we go. And this time, instead of creating it, moving it, and creating a group in motor, I'm just going to group it right off the bat. Something freeze transformations. Oh, look at that. Show my grid. Let's put its pivot right at the grid. There we go. Edit, delete by type history. Okay, great. And I'm going to call this FK control generic, because I don't know where I'm going to put it just yet. But what I'm going to do is group it to itself by using Control G and group FK control. And I'm just going to cut to the chase and just make this control snap to it, rather than having to put the control there, then another group, and then parent.